Welcome back to the episode of Wrong Sports, and since you're here, that means you are a college sports fan. And since you are one, you know that college sports have a lot of conferences all around the country and throughout all of the divisions of college sports. And if you have seen previous episodes of this series, Conference Talk, you have seen me go over 2 conferences already, and I hope to go over more, if not all, of the conferences at some point in this series. But in this episode, I'm going to be covering a conference that went through a nasty dissolution before reforming to become a top conference that we all know of today. This episode of Conference Talk is all about the original Pacific Coast Conference, how it formed, the good, the bad, and the untimely end of this conference. But before I get to that, make sure that you subscribe below to the channel and of course ring the bell for updates when I'm going to be dropping brand new videos. Plus make sure you help out the channel by checking out my Patreon. You can check that out in the description below. You can also see my podcast link in the description below along with my social media. And also make sure you like and share this video with other college sports fans. So before I talk about how the PCC ended, let's start with how it formed and became the preeminent conference on the West Coast. The Pacific Coast Conference was established on December 2nd, 1915, with its 4 charter members: the University of California, now known as University of California, Berkeley, the University of Washington, the University of Oregon, and Oregon Agricultural College, which is now known as Oregon State University. The conference would turn into a 6-team conference pretty quickly with the addition of Washington State in 1917 and Stanford in 1918. So on this channel, I mostly talk about college football when I talk about conferences, and you might be looking for football stats for some of these teams, and while you might find some for a few of these colleges, you also won't, and that is because during the 1910s, football out west was kind of weird, with some teams playing American football and others playing rugby. This was due to football being viewed as too violent. Stanford was one of these schools that played football in the late 1800s and early 1900s, including going to the first Rose Bowl game in 1902, but then they dropped football to play rugby from 1905 to 1918. Stanford wasn't particularly good at it, and with Stanford's agreement to enter the PCC, they would start back their football program in 1919 and go through some down years as they entered the 1920s. Cal also didn't play football for a time during the 1910s, but they ended up getting a lot better. And when the 1920s kicked off, it saw some big changes around the country, with prosperity going all around with the Roaring '20s, and it also brought good things to the conference, as the Pacific Coast Conference were getting very good. Example 1 being the Cal Bears, who were the best team out west. As they went undefeated in 1920, they won the Rose Bowl, and some media writers picked them as the national champion. They then went undefeated again in 1921 and went to the Rose Bowl, and went undefeated again in 1922, and unbeaten with several ties in 1923 and 1924. But Cal didn't go to the Rose Bowl in any of those years, and more on that in a second. But their winning showed that West Coast football was here to stay and was on par with Eastern football. With the Pacific Coast Conference riding high, they would add USC in 1922, and then Idaho that same year too. USC though was the real headliner that year because mostly they were a big school in LA, and also they were invited to the Rose Bowl in 1923. And that was even though USC lost to Cal that year. The conference would add another Western school in 1924. This time it was Montana. And Montana, like Idaho, would be shunned to the back, and more on that in a moment. But the final team to be added to this conference was in 1928, with the University of California, Los Angeles. Now, they weren't named that at the time, but UCLA was a late invite to the conference due to them not being a 4-year school until 1925, as they were a junior college before that, and competed in the Southern California Intercollegiate Athletic Association, which was and still is a conference for smaller colleges in the Los Angeles area, and I will go over that in a future episode. But UCLA was added in 1928 to give this conference 10 colleges that would compete for the prize of being invited to the Rose Bowl, and to be named the best college sports team out west in all other sports. So now that I introduced all the teams in the PCC, let's get to where it all fell apart, because it happened pretty much as soon as they all got together. USC was the first team to start the troubles, as there would be rumors of the school paying for players and giving them extra benefits. Cal and Stanford were the two that pushed USC to give in and say that they had cheated. USC would deny it and said that most of this was because Cal and Stanford were the two Northern California schools, and they were attacking USC due to them being in Southern California and at the time being the only Southern California school, and also there being a rivalry between Northern California and Southern California. The cheating story came to a head on November 1st, 1924, when the Trojans were in Berkeley to play the Cal Bears. Before the game, the Cal officials met with the USC officials and informed them that Cal and Stanford had jointly decided to sever all athletic relations with USC at the end of the football season. The Bears then put an extra salt in the wound by beating the Trojans 7-0. This was USC's first loss of the season and Cal's 6th consecutive win over USC. After this game, USC was even more pissed and canceled their next week's game versus Stanford, since Stanford would cancel their next year's game. USC would find a replacement pretty quickly in St. Mary's, but Stanford would play Utah, but they wouldn't play them at Stanford Stadium due to a scheduling conflict with their freshman team, and instead played in Berkeley at Cal Stadium. So this was the first turd in the punch bowl moment. After that, the PCC would suspend USC for the 1925 season, which basically meant they couldn't be chosen for the Rose Bowl or conference champion, and teams could say that they wouldn't play them. Cal was one of those teams, but Stanford would end up playing USC in 1925 even after all that controversy. With the suspension, at the end of the season, USC would fire their head coach and hire a famous one from Iowa in Howard Jones. USC never gave a reason for hiring a new coach and didn't say it was because of their suspension, but since USC lost to Cal 6 straight times, that was given as a big reason for hiring Jones. USC would be reinstated towards the end of 1925, so the conference was back to normal that year. It would be a normal 10-team conference for the next decade or so, but it was clear that there were some colleges that thought of themselves higher than others, and that caused some more hiccups. Those colleges were the California schools. They all thought they were better than pretty much everyone. To go along with that, most of the California schools disliked one another, so they thought the non-California schools were even lower than that. This was clear with a big donor in Edwin Pauley. He was a grad of Cal Berkeley and a millionaire through oil companies in the 1920s. He disliked pretty much all the universities in the Pacific Coast Conference, but he mostly disliked the Pacific Northwest universities, enough to advocate that the California institutions should leave the PCC to form a California conference. Now, no California school was interested, and instead the Northwestern schools rarely played California schools, and when they did, it was usually on the road. And I'll get to more about that later because that caused even more of a tear in this conference. But there was clear competitive disadvantages in the PCC, especially with Northwestern schools and California schools. To remedy that, the conference would have Edwin Atherton. He was a former FBI agent and now a private investigator that got famous for investigating and uncovering corruption in the San Francisco Police Department. He was hired to do the same on the PCC. It took Atherton a good 2 years to report on everything that was going on, and this was a lengthy report, in that it was 2 million words, so clearly I didn't read it, but I did read the summary of it, and I'll summarize it as quickly as possible. He uncovered colleges pushing recruits very hard to commit to their college before visiting others. Example of that would be getting a hotel room, putting the recruit in the room, and then really pushing him to sign hard on the agreement so that it would pretty much consider him going to any other school null and void. Along with that, he also uncovered schools paying them and also giving them other perks before recruits were on campus. And also, he found that players were getting jobs that would be a cover to pay for their scholarships at the school. That was going on for decades after as well. An example would be a kid getting a job at, say, a car dealership and not selling any cars, but still getting a $500 a week paycheck because he worked somehow. There are a lot of ways to get around pretty much anything, especially in the 20s and 30s. But anyway, because of this, the schools agreed there needed to be a change, and their first change was to get a new commissioner. and the PCC was one of the only conferences to have a commissioner at this point. They also had a governing body and a voting body, and they would vote in a new commissioner for the 1940 season, that being Atherton. Since Atherton did so much work in the previous 2 years, he would step in immediately and put in reforms to clean up the conference, like get rid of free perks to recruits, or the recruits will be ineligible at the conference. He also had them get rid of financial aid to recruits, put safeguards on athletic funds so it goes to other sports teams. Example being schools setting up an alumni fund and capping the donation limit. This would help other teams on campus stay equal with football and basketball teams. And another thing he put a cap on was not to have too many athletic scholarships for specific sports. This was in football and basketball because there were obviously a lot of scholarships going to those two teams and not to anything else. Atherton started to clean it up and ran a tight ship in the PCC, but this was during World War II, when most teams, especially out west, didn't play football, or really any other sports during World War II. This was due to security reasons after the Pearl Harbor attack, and also due to most college-age men going off to fight. One example being only USC, UCLA, Cal, and Washington would play football in 1943 and 1944. And you can see more about wartime football in my video about service football. I'll put a link above to that. But eventually the conference would be back to 10 full-time teams in the 1945 season. Unfortunately, Atherton wouldn't make it to the 1945 season, as he would die of a gallbladder illness in August of 1944. His assistant, Victor Schmidt, would take over and be the commissioner for the next decade plus. But when Schmidt became the commissioner, college sports was really changing. And so was the world, as we are now getting out of World War II and we were starting to get back to normal. When that happened, colleges exploded all over the country. There were many men and women looking to go to school and work, as they would have money from working during the war or money from the GI Bill. With the new college-age men on campus, it exploded sports programs all over, and it helped pretty much every school, but the bigger ones more than the smaller ones. If you were a big-name school like Cal, USC, Washington, etc., you reaped the benefits of a bigger recruiting class and older, more experienced players, as they had eligibility left due to the war. The smaller schools like Montana, Idaho, Washington State, Oregon State found it tough to get those really good players unless those players were local. Along with that, even though the PCC had a commissioner, there was still shady business going on, as there were rumors of secret slush funds at schools all over. So remember how I mentioned about how Atherton supposedly put in safeguards on the PCC and those alumni funds? Well, he wanted to put a cap on it, having alumni give upwards of maybe $40, no more than $50 tops. But apparently it was common to completely ignore that and do a secret fund. Most, if not all of the schools, not only in the PCC, but all over college football had them. And they had great ways of hiding them. And to start the 1950s, it wasn't fully known what colleges and boosters were doing to work together to get money in college sports, but people knew there was something going on. Eventually, there was enough complaining and the NCAA would get involved, but they wouldn't investigate the California schools. Instead, they would first investigate Oregon and find that local businessmen were putting money into the university to give jobs to the players so that they can play for scholarships and other things at the school. Oregon would be forced to admit this, and they would fire their head coach in basketball, that was John Warren, and their head football coach, that was Jim Aiken. Now, this wouldn't be big nationally, as the PCC were able to keep the issues at Oregon quiet for a little bit, but they couldn't keep the next scandal under wraps, as it would happen in Seattle with the University of Washington. Washington was using the same pay-for-play booster clubs, and it was starting to get out of hand by 1955. The story starts with the coach of the Washington football team. His name was John Shearberg. He was a star on the Washington football team in the 1930s, and he became coach in 1953, after a few years of being an assistant at Washington. The team struggled during the 1953 and 1954 seasons, as they had losing records, but in 1955 they started really good, as they went 4-0, including beating USC. But just as they were starting to get a great season, this was according to the coach, by the way, the men who run the secret slush fund that pays his players for extracurricular salaries had used their money to turn the players against the coach. By midseason, there were calls of wanting the head coach fired, and they were having their best season under him, so this was kind of weird. The distraction of his calls for firing and the fact that apparently 30 players on the football team had joined the Boosters in an organized revolt resulted in the team going 1-4-1 to end the season and ruin any hopes of a Rose Bowl or a PCC title. After the season, Washington would get rid of Shearberg, but like Oregon, Washington would also point to California to be investigated next, and that would open up a Pandora's box full of just a lot of crap. So with the NCAA finally getting the idea to investigate California schools, they did something that would make it a little easier for them, and that was giving free rein to the local newspapers to help in the investigation. And this wouldn't be good for the California schools, especially UCLA, which were going through a great time in the 1950s under their football coach Red Sanders. As they went 34-5, they went to 2 Rose Bowls, and they had a national title in 1954. Meanwhile, USC, under their head coach Jess Hill, was winning 8 games a year, and Cal was still very good under Pappy Wardorf, but not as good as they were at the end of the 1940s when they went undefeated for 3 straight regular seasons and went to the Rose Bowl. So as you can tell, the California schools were a lot better than their Northwestern counterparts, and it was pretty noticeable that something was happening as California schools pushed way past everyone else in the 1950s in all the other sports. And with Northwestern teams pointing more of a finger at the California schools, the investigation started, and it wouldn't take long for the newspapers to find something, as they found something in March of 1956, as 2 LA newspapers reported on illegal activities of the Bruin Bench and the Young Men's Club of Westwood. Now, this was told to them by a player who had transferred from UCLA to Cal. Apparently, UCLA attempted to block the investigation, refusing to allow conference and NCAA officials to investigate the club for 10 weeks. But after finally admitting that coaches had consented to booster payments for years, UCLA did what every school in the PCC was doing, and that was blame someone else, as they accused USC and Cal of doing the same thing, which of course they had too. Due to all of this, UCLA and USC received 3 years of crippling sanctions. They got postseason bans, which really hurt since UCLA won the PCC from 1953 to 1955. Both schools also got television bans, scholarship reductions, and so much more. Cal, meanwhile, received slightly less punishment for its part, but the fact that the punishment was even being handed down to these California schools by non-California schools was enough to start the breakup of this conference. And the breakup would start pretty soon after all that went down, as Cal and UCLA announced that due to the scandals, they were putting in their own plan to clean up the school, and part of their plan was leaving the conference. And since they were both part of the California college system, they would do everything together, and that would be the first death nail for the conference. So even before they left, the PCC was down to 9 colleges at this point, as Montana after World War II couldn't keep up with the California schools, which rarely played Montana anyway, and also they couldn't compete with the Northwest schools either, and they were mostly phased out of the conference by 1951. With Cal and UCLA leaving, it would put the conference at 7 teams, but really 6, since Idaho was like Montana in that they were shunned by California schools. No California school would play Idaho after the 1950 season, and Idaho couldn't compete on the field against Northwestern schools, and really couldn't get enough fans to come to home games, resulting in many road games, since other teams in the Pacific Coast Conference didn't want to spend a ton of money coming to Idaho if they weren't going to make it back. One example for this was USC came to Idaho once, That was back in 1925, and it was probably a punishment due to their 1924 suspension. But USC would never go to Idaho again, and they stopped playing Idaho altogether by the early 1940s. So now with 6 schools holding all the power, the first thing they did was fire the commissioner, Victor Schmidt, in 1957. This was mostly for cosmetics, as this conference would quickly disband only a few weeks later, with the 1958-59 season being the last for the conference. The rebirth would happen with the California schools, as they would quickly band together and get Washington on their side to announce a new Western Conference to start in 1959. It was called the American Association of Western Universities. And they got the guaranteed bid to the Rose Bowl starting in 1962, so that also was a huge plus for this new conference. The conference would only have 5 teams for a few years. The other 3 schools from the PCC, Oregon, Oregon State, and Washington State, would go independent for sports for the next few years, but they would all eventually get invited to the new AAWU, first in 1962 for Washington State, and then in 1964 for the Oregon schools. So this gave the AAWU 8 schools and pretty much what the PCC was for all those years, minus Idaho and Montana, which were mostly outliers of the conference since the 1910s. But the real reason for the PCC crumbling down came to, of course, greed, businessmen using their money to improve college sports when really no one asked them to. Plus, it also had a little bit to do with some schools, that being the California schools, thinking that they were better than the other Western schools and treating non-California schools as bottom feeders. The PCC did try to make their conference work, as they had a commissioner and rules in the 1920s and 1930s, way before other conferences did. But once the post-World War II period hit and college sports changed because the competitive balance changed too, the PCC couldn't really do anything to remedy it, besides closing up shop and working on a rebirth. The Pac-12 is now one of the strongest conferences in the country, and is still a conference that invites members based on academic prestige and not sporting prestige, which has helped their member schools stay together for so long. And thank you so much for hanging out with me for Conference Talk Episode 3, all about the Pacific Coast Conference, the rise, the death, and the rebirth of this conference. And make sure you like and share this video with other college football fans, and of course, subscribe below and ring the bell so you can get updates on when I'm going to be dropping brand new videos. And check out the description below for my Patreon, my podcast, and my social media. And have a fantastic rest of your day.